Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us during your lunch, or if you're watching us on replay, thank you very much for watching us on recording. So today, for May's LinkedIn Live, we're chatting to somebody with great entrepreneurial spirit about his impressive career that spans over 15 years within the financial services industry. More recently, he was part of the founder of Lendable, and that is a fintech platform that was designed to harness technology and data to make accessing loans a lot easier for the customer. That platform has gone crazy. It's done really, really well. It's now transformed lending in both the UK and the US. And the customer-centric solutions we're going to dive into a little bit more as to why and what and how he's done this. So Chris Bosworth joins us today. He's the managing director, or former managing director. He's still very much part of the business and is now taking a little bit of a different slant in terms of fractional career, bit of a portfolio career, and he's going to talk us through that. But he has a really, really interesting view on talent, and I guess he is a perfect example of he is what he says and what he's trying to, cultivate within the business of entrepreneurship. So welcome, Chris. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Lovely to have you on today and find out a little bit more.
Great. Yeah. Where do you want to start?
All right. So first of all, I guess, could you tell us a little bit about your early career and how you got into financial services? Because I bet you didn't leave school or university going, I want a career in fintech.
Well, sort of did actually to some extent. I don't know. So I did the graduate scheme at Capital One, which a lot of people in consumer finance in the UK did, which kind of was a fintech before the word fintech was really a thing. So, Nigel Morris and Rich Fairbanks, the founders of Capital One, founded it as a small data-enabled consumer lender. Obviously now, you forget because time moves on, but obviously it's now one of a large US bank and a big global lender. But it did start as a fintech, and obviously Nigel's gone on to do QED Investors, which is one of the big fintech venture capital funds. So in a sense, I did leave university and join a fintech, but yeah, it was definitely a little bit different to what it is now. The whole environment was very different, and obviously, by the time I joined Capital One, it was already quite large. It had a huge presence in Nottingham and at the time actually presence overseas as well. Although when I was there, they sort of retrenched from Europe. To that extent I did. But then after that, I went into investment banking for a while as well, which again is quite an interesting evolution on that model, because you start to think about how investors think about things, and particularly we did a lot of private equity transactions at that time. And then I think the big one for me, the sort of turning point where I changed my view on work, I guess, was the Irish financial crisis. So I used to work for an investment bank called Hawke Point. We played a large role in the restructuring of Irish banks following the Irish financial crisis. And I think it just made, you speak to a lot of people in those banks, they were big banks, people forget how big Anglo-Irish, etc. were. People had devoted their whole careers to these banks, given them such loyalty, and then they collapsed. And I think that was when my, I guess, risk appetite changed, and I realized that, what you think is a safe, secure place to work may well not be, and therefore the ones that don't feel safe and secure maybe aren't as bad as you think. And I did a few different roles, internal and external. So as we talked about before, so after Hawke Point, I went to Close Brothers, did corporate development there, which included a lot of I guess what you call like corporate venture capital. So these ideas of a investing in businesses or buying businesses to help them grow. also ran a division at one stage of that bank as well, which again was a really good experience. And that gave me the platform to join the team at Lendable to found AutoLend, as you mentioned at the beginning. So yeah, that was 2019. We founded AutoLend, which is the UK car finance business of Lendable, which, as you say, has been Lendable in general has been a huge success, and I'd like to think AutoLend has been a huge success as well. And then as part of that, I've transitioned away from that business earlier in the year, and still doing a little bit of work there, but also, as you say, looking at a more broader range of things to do going forward, I guess. So I think you used the phrase portfolio career in your intro, so I guess it's that sort of thing. And that's where we are really. And I guess to talk to your bit about the approach to talent, I suppose, I guess that stems almost, from that journey. And actually, I hadn't really thought about it until you just maybe go through it historically, but probably does stem all the way back to the time at Capital One. That was a very entrepreneurial culture. And I think a lot of companies use that phrase, entrepreneurial culture, but they don't really mean it. Like, they mean they want you to stay and work hard and spend 30 years in the same place, especially if they're going to invest in your development. But when I was at Capital One, we had some really successful people leave and found other companies. And even after I left, more people left and founded other companies. So TDX, that you may have come across, was ex-Capital One people. ClearScore was ex-Capital One individual. And I'm backed by Nigel, who founded Capital One. So there's, it's an interesting ecosystem that you can create that way. And I say at Lendable, we've definitely done that as well. And even within AutoLend, some of our high performers that normally you would be, I guess, disappointed that they've left the business. You can't really have that attitude because, you hired them because of their entrepreneurial spirit and their entrepreneurial flair. And so when they leave to start their own thing, you have to sort of take that as a positive. And I think that's real entrepreneurial culture, where you can have team members that leave and you wish them best. And in fact, in some cases, some of the colleagues actually invested in their startups. So, and that, I think, is something that's missing in the UK versus the US, is these ecosystems. I know certain other firms have got similar ones. I think like Monzo and Revolut, you hear a lot of people talk about being ex-Monzo, ex-Revolut. And I hope that, Lendable is kind of beginning to have that sort of impact as well. And I'd say Capital One definitely did. I think about some of my former colleagues at Capital One and what they're doing now. They're everywhere basically. So it's interesting, and that's I think that's really important to me, is to be quite authentic when you talk about entrepreneurial culture, and not like can be in some big banks where it's a bit of a buzzword, but no one really means it, and people would be very disappointed if you left to start your own business.
So what does that mean? What does that look like for the team at Lendable that you've created there?
Yeah, well, I guess it starts with hiring, right? So when you're bringing someone in, I think there's a lot of conversations around culture in general, but I would say it's slightly different from culture, because what you're really looking for is like attitude. And there are some very competent people that need a lot of support, and that doesn't make them any less competent, but it means that they're probably not going to be a fit in that dynamic environment. So if you really want people, we talked in the past, you and I've talked before about risk appetite, and a lot of it is about risk appetite, both in your day-to-day work and in your career path. And people with that low risk appetite, that want to take a job at a big clearing bank, or in the sort of career strategy, or in their day-to-day work, they're not really willing to take risks. They want people from 3 levels above them to sign everything off before they do anything. That attitude is not going to help you in a highly entrepreneurial environment. And I think the two, from a personality perspective, are correlated. So you've got to look for that attitude of someone that is willing to take risks in their career, which generally means they're willing to join you in the early stages, which obviously, not everyone is willing to do that. But also it does mean that in the day to day, they're a little bit more of a risk taker. And there's a balancing act, because obviously we work in financial services. So, people need to take risks within the, conduct risk frameworks. But, there's lots of risk you can take in terms of operational and technical risk, trying to do things better that don't impact your regulatory status. So I think that is really important, is to look for people that do that have that attitude. But as I say, the corollary of that is they're also probably likely to leave you after a period of time. And I don't think, if that's the culture and attitude you want to promote, then having what to some other lenders might look like a reasonably high staff turnover is not necessarily a bad thing. So, people might look at your turnover and say, well, I've been working with you for 7 years now. I'm on my, the third product manager we've liaised with. It's like, yeah, but what the other two that left, they are still friends with the business. They've got their own businesses maybe now. And it's all really positive. Whereas I think, I've worked in places before, more traditional sort of banking environments, where they may not have quite the same turnover, but the people that do leave, when they leave, it's not positive. That's the end of their relationship with your business, and they've probably maybe even gone to a competitor. And I do think that's quite interesting as well, is that not a lot of people that have left us go to work for competitors, because they're leaving for something different. They're leaving because they feel they've done what they can do in UK consumer finance. And if they wanted to do more in UK consumer finance, they'd stay with us, if you see what I mean. So it's not a negative departure. And I do think that's really interesting. And I guess that's what I'm saying, is the high level metrics that people in HR and recruitment might measure is, maybe don't look so good, doesn't necessarily mean that you've got a bad working environment. In fact, sometimes it can actually mean the opposite. And, I think that's what I've experienced. And obviously a lot of people move internally as well, which also helps. And that's one of the nice things about AutoLend being part of Lendable is, if someone feels they've done enough in UK car finance, they want to do credit cards, they want to do loans, they want to do the US. I had a couple of people move from the UK to the US. That's great, right? That's a really interesting opportunity for those people. But equally as well, if you feel you've run to the end of your road, no one's going to object to you leaving. And in fact, people probably will help you. And particularly if that is to do your own thing, it's a really supportive culture and network to help you do that, basically.
So you mentioned the UK are far behind that in terms of the US doing that. Do you think that's because we are still measuring against the attrition metric, the hard metrics? How else would we measure that in terms of moving a culture towards that?
Yeah, I think there is this like psychological thing about what work is. I think it's probably an element of British conservatism as well. Like, I know when I left university, you talk about did you leave university, you want to join a fintech, but people, they wanted to join, say, accounting firms. Now, I knew that wasn't for me, but there was always that thought in the back of your head that, well, if I get my accountancy exams, I'll never be without a job, sort of thing. And it was a lot more of that approach, where it's sort of, how do I get stability? How do I ensure I'm going to get a regular income? And it's not a risk-taking mentality, just culturally. And obviously we've seen like UK productivity has slipped behind some of these other nations. And I think a lot of that is to do with that approach. People go for stability, and then if something derails that stability, it almost breaks them to some extent. Whereas I think if you're have a deeper risk appetite, and you're willing to take more risk, and gain higher rewards, then that has two implications. One is you're kind of used to failing, because high risk is by its very nature, you fail before you succeed. and I've definitely done that. So you get used to failure a bit more, it makes you a bit more resilient, I think. And then obviously the rewards that come with being successful are quite high. And I think one of the things, again, the US maybe does better than the UK, is people understand when they get those rewards that it's by being part of that ecosystem that they've been able to achieve that, and they often will reinvest into that space. And I think that's starting to happen in the UK now. I speak to a few people that founded their own fintech businesses maybe 10, 15 years ago. I mean, actually, Nigel Morris at Capital One is a prime example, right? The guy runs a venture capital fund now. So, people do reinvest in the sector, but it's not as common. It's not almost like an obligation. Whereas I think particularly in the sort of Silicon Valley space and in the sort of Boston environment as well, there's almost an expectation if you have a £10 million exit, 9 of that has to go back into the system. You don't buy a house in Spain or whatever, which I think here there is an element of, people are on this hamster wheel, they get the exit, they leave, and it's like, I'm retired, I'm out. Whereas I think in the US, people have more of an obligation to keep it going for the next generation. And hopefully we can start to sort of get that over here as well. But, you need enough people with enough exits to sort of keep that going, I guess.
And I think this conversation's really important in showing a business that has embraced that and is brave enough to talk about it.
Yeah.
And put themselves out there. It is a very brave and different way to talk about talent management.
Yeah, and I think obviously it's not. I think in general we do have to change the way we think about talent management. I mean, again, I don't know if you've seen this in the US. I think it's California just prohibited non-compete clauses like legally in contracts and things like that. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm always a bit disappointed if someone leaves to a competitor because it means you haven't given someone the opportunity that they can get somewhere else. So we don't actually, I would still see that as a bad lever. But I do think just it tells you a lot about the governmental intent in California to remove those, to make those clauses illegal, means that they want a moving talent market where people can move around and, gain that experience quicker. I'm sure you've come across this 10,000 hours concept of, if you want to get really good at something, you need to put the time in. And I think one of the things that I, will always be grateful to about investment banking, I'm not sure they do this anymore, but, they're very long hours, like 100 hours a week. Well, on the plus side, that means is, in 2 years, you've got amazing experience because you have got your 10,000 hours. So it's interesting in that respect. If you can, allow people to grow really quickly, and often that can't really happen in one organization, particularly at the earlier stages where you've only got 40, 50 people in the org. You just can't give people that opportunity. I mean, one of the lucky things or not lucky, whatever you want to call it, one of the benefits of being part of Lendable was obviously it was a huge growth company, 60-ish people when I joined in 2019 and over 400 when I left earlier in the year. So it's that growth gives individuals the opportunity to grow as well, but not every company is going to have that amazing track record. So you've got to realize that there's a bit more fluidity in the market, and let people move around a little bit more to get that experience. And also, I think one of the nice things that happened at Lendable that, again, I think people don't always see as a positive, or they don't sort of push on, is that people leaving and coming back. And I think, I've worked in places before that once you've left, and, as I say, it's kind of a bit of a bridge burning exercise often leaving, because, people vent on all the things they didn't like and you can never really come back. Whereas there's a really high proportion of people who leave and then a couple of years later come back. And I think that is really positive as well, because it shows that, yes, the business didn't have that thing for me that I needed at that time. But now I've gone and achieved that somewhere else, and actually I'd rather come back and take that experience and move to the next step within the company. So I think that's another thing as well, actually. We talk about entrepreneurial spirit and, learning from failure and things like that. But also, I think as an employer, being open-minded to someone coming back is really positive and not something everywhere does.
And I think having those returners kind of demonstrates what you talk about an ecosystem.
Yeah.
Go away, do your thing, and come back with whatever you've learned outside and bring it back to the business, I guess, isn't it?
100%. And also, it having those people in the business to have discussions with colleagues as well, especially maybe a colleague who is thinking about leaving for whatever reason. It's like, we'll go and talk to this individual. They got to the same point as you. They did leave. They're now back. They can tell you the pros and cons of their experience. And I think that is also really powerful as well, when you've got a group like that where everyone is very ambitious. And I think, we talk about entrepreneurialism, but entrepreneurialism and ambition are kind of, corollaries, especially, in younger people. I think, it's kind of that risk appetite is because they have the high risk appetite because they want to get somewhere quickly, and you have to support people in that, but not to the extent of where it's misplaced or arrogance, so there is also a quite a delicate measuring act of, you want to give people the opportunities when they're ready for them. You want people to be able to access those opportunities elsewhere when they're ready for them, but you also need to genuinely be able to communicate with them when they're not. So, explain to people why they are not ready for the next step they think they are. And do that in a respectful way so that, they don't, fall out with you, I guess, in the nicest possible way. So, yeah, I mean, all of these things are connected to each other in that sense. So it's an interesting way of managing a team.
It is. It's turning it on its head slightly, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's give them the tools to go off and fly, I guess.
Yeah.
So we've talked about your leadership style, which is really refreshing to hear. But who's inspired your career? Let's talk a bit more about you, Chris.
Ooh, I mean, there's always lots of interesting people that you work with along the way, isn't there? I mean, as I say, obviously at Cat One, the founders, Rich and Nigel were, even today when you hear them speak, they're just incredibly inspirational people. I'd say some of the people that left Cat One start their own business, Mark, who left to do TDX, or Justin, who left to do ClearScore, again, very inspirational people. I think, I guess the interesting one is people I haven't worked with, actually. That's always an interesting one. And even competitors, I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, but, Aidan Rushby at Carl Muller is quite an inspirational person for me. He knew nothing about the sector. I'd run a car finance business at a bank before, so before I did this, I knew what I was doing. He came completely from outside the sector and did it as well. I mean, and they're a competitor, but you still have a lot of respect for those people. And I think that, he's an interesting individual. I think some of our suppliers over the years that, I think that's the other thing, talk about ecosystems. I've always been open to using other startups, whereas I think, when you are a startup, especially if you've got your venture capital backed, it's a little bit challenging on the procurement side to use other startups, but I've always tried to do that where you can. We've got a really good relationship, or Autoland's got a really good relationship with Brago. It's one of the emerging sort of AI vehicle valuation providers, which again is a small team, but very, very highly motivated individuals. And then I guess, some of the people at Lendable that have left and done their own thing, I guess they, Luis Gallas, one of the data engineers, went off and did his own thing. We had a really good product manager in Motor, Fred, who's just come out of stealth on his own thing. So it's, I think those people, are really interesting and really inspiring. And then, not to completely slag off the big banks, I think good leaders in big banks are also really interesting. The CEO of Close Brothers, when I was there, Preben Prebenson, and my boss, Tazim Masani, were, fantastic people to work with. super smart, very analytical, which again, not all senior management, a lot of people get senior management by being able to do the politics side of it, whereas those guys were genuinely good at the actual doing as well, which I think in the world of startups becomes very, very important, because there's no fat in the org structure for people to just be people managers. So you kind of have to be a player manager, to use a football pun. So I think it's always interesting when you've worked in FTSE 350 bank where the CEO is also a bit of a player manager. I think that's pretty inspirational as well. So that was good.
Excellent. So what's been your proudest achievement?
Oh, that's an interesting one, isn't it? I think a lot of them aren't really my achievement. I guess it's what other people have done, I suppose. It's where you've enabled someone to do something, that changes the game a little bit. I think, when especially in the startup world, you get in these rabbit holes of, you're just working on something constantly. It's dominating, all your time. It's not until you then take a step back and you realize what you've really achieved, and I think, obviously it's the most recent thing, but you think about AutoLend, where, speaking to Martin, who's the CEO and founder of Lendable back in 2019, it was an idea. And then 5 years later, it's a meaningful player in that market, and from literally nothing. So it's kind of, I find things like that, it's only when you look back on them, you really proud of them, but also you're really grateful to the people that gave you that opportunity. And I think that's why this whole ecosystem is really important to me, because it's easy for me to say now, well, not easy, but I now want to be the sort of giver on that side, but that's only because I was a taker of it in the past. So you've got to be very grateful to the people that have let you do those things in the past, and hopefully enable someone else to do it in the future, and they can be grateful back. So it's you just want to perpetuate that cycle, really.
Brilliant. So what would you say has been, now this is a really difficult one, what would you say your biggest challenge has been in your professional career?
I think it's just what we talked about a little bit there, with sort of managing people's expectations. In a very successful culture, in a very successful business where you want people to be entrepreneurial, there is always going to be the odd individual gets ahead of themselves, and you want to be supportive. You want to find them the exposure or the thing that they need. But you do need to rein them in a little bit. And I think having those conversations is really difficult, because you don't want to stifle someone's creativity. You don't want to stifle that entrepreneurial aspect of their personality, but equally, they need relevant experience. And I think that's always difficult, to be fair. And I still haven't worked out how to do that perfectly, to be honest.
And what about inclusivity in a business? What's your
Yeah.
leadership style in promoting inclusivity of diversity of thinking from different backgrounds? What can businesses do in the space that you're in to encourage more from diverse talent pools join and be innovative as well?
Yeah, I'm not a massive fan of the word diversity, because I think it's been a bit tainted by sort of diversity and initiatives and stuff like that. I've forgotten the lady's name. I wrote it. There's a really good book called Inclusify that I'm a massive fan of, that is more about inclusivity. And I think that sort of concept, where it isn't a tick box exercise, is much more pertinent to me, and being aware of your biases and being inclusive across the piece, and not just ticking a box on gender or ticking a box on race, but actually having real diversity of thought, as you say. So even if that is socioeconomic background, even if that is, car finance in general is actually really good for this, because there's this whole, the whole concept of showroom to boardroom type thing. A lot of people start their careers working in car showrooms, and you can work your way up. So it's actually an interesting sector for that, because, you know, sales and the numbers don't lie a lot of the time. So I think car finance in general is a good one. Obviously, the Automotive 30% Club's done a really good job on gender, but there's all these other like parameters as well that I think, you know, having a truly inclusive working environment where you're not just ticking boxes and you're genuinely collaborating with people from lots of different backgrounds, I think is really interesting. And whether that is race, whether that's gender, whether that's sexuality, whether that's say socioeconomic background, education background. I mean, I've worked with so many people that are some of the smartest people I've been exposed to, that maybe went to, I don't know what you call them, but basically non-red brick universities, and other people would maybe be quite dismissive of their skill set. And it's only when you start working with them day to day, you realize that actually they are super, super smart, and you don't know their story. You don't know why, they went to X place rather than, Oxbridge or whatever. So without knowing someone's true self, and their full personality, you shouldn't and can't really make those judgments. And I think as soon as you remove those biases from or become cognizant, you can't really remove them. I mean, we'd all love to, but you can't. Once you become cognizant of those biases, you can and allow for them, you can actually open yourself up to a whole pool of talent that other people maybe were quite dismissive of. And I think commercially that then becomes a positive, because basically you get to have all these people that other people have screened. I mean, I think this whole applicant management system approach to recruitment at the moment is causing lots of problems, to be honest, because people don't take the time to get to know the people that have applied for their roles. And like anything, you just miss really good candidates, I think.
We are certainly seeing that in recruitment with the rise and accessibility of ease of AI now. Everybody can be a brain surgeon by typing in, make me look good at this, or, what have you with a CV. And that's where I think the human interaction in the recruitment and selection process is becoming more and more important now, to 100%. Be able to get to know the people behind all of these brain surgeons on the CVs, because you're going to miss them.
Yeah, I mean, it works both ways. Some people can massively overinflate their ability using GBT, but you do get the other people that aren't using those tools, are being a bit more authentic. Say maybe didn't go to the best university or whatever, but actually for what you're going to be super competent, and they've got the ambition, they've got the right attitude. And if you don't speak to them, you will never know. Once you've spoken to them, you almost always know immediately. So it is an interesting one. I think people are very important on people, which is kind of self-evident, but these days doesn't really seem to be always taken that way.
Totally. So what would you say would be your biggest mistake that you've done in your professional career, and what have you learned from that? Because you're a champion for learning from failure, as we've talked about previous. So what has been your biggest mistake, and what did you learn?
Oh, I mean, loads, to be honest. I mean, I think just witnessing failure is also quite interesting. So as I say, when I first started at Capital One, they were retrenching from Europe, and I thought that was quite interesting, just the way they dealt with that, the way they took the learnings from it. I thought that was really good. I say the Irish financial crisis, you're unraveling it, you sort of see how it got into that state, and again, you can learn a lot from it. And even myself, I've had, before Autolend and the success we've seen with that business, I had a couple of failed startups as well. So it's interesting because people obviously don't talk about those as much, and they certainly don't generally put them in their pitch decks, but they actually do shape you more than the successes in a way. Like in the success, it's very difficult to pick apart and work out why it was so successful. Whereas the failure, it's actually normally relatively straightforward to work out why it was a failure. You just got one of your key assumptions very wrong. At least that's been my experience. There's a couple of things, one or two things generally is enough to derail something. So I think that's quite important, is to fail, because it's just, in a lazy way, it's easier to learn from failure than it is to learn from success. I think it is a bit more difficult to pick apart why something has been successful. But I think if you don't try, you'll never know. So I wouldn't say failure has put me off trying again. But again, I think I've hopefully learned a lot from it, in the sense of knowing what I would do differently. And how even when if I work with other people, because it doesn't always have to be a startup, work with other people, the less you can bring your lessons to that relationship as well, which I think is really interesting. And I think startup is a lot more, is quite challenging, but I think scale up is even more challenging. And again, that's another one that the UK is not amazingly good at. Got all these schemes like startup loans and stuff for, really small companies. But I know it's something the government are looking at the moment, but the fact that pension funds can't really invest in growth rounds and stuff like that, it's a bit of sort of cutting off your nose to spite your face, really. You've got this interesting sector, and financial services has always been a problem as well, because it's not eligible for a lot of the startup schemes and things like that. So it's a bit odd. You've got the UK, has got this huge amount of expertise and strength in financial services, but you can't raise an EIS round in a financial services business. So it's quite an interesting dynamic. And obviously we've got an election coming up soon, so maybe that will spur some change, or maybe it'll just delay change. I don't really know, but it will be interesting to see the approaches going forward in terms of getting the money into entrepreneurial businesses in sectors that we as a nation are good at, which I don't think historically has always been the case.
So looking at all of what we've talked about, in summary, what advice would you give to anybody that's inspiring to set up a startup, or has that entrepreneurial spirit, or is looking to be a leader? What have you taken from your life lessons that you would say would be your biggest tips to other people?
It's funny, yeah. I won't say who it was, because I don't want to throw them under a bus, but I once got asked to talk at to an MBA class at a university about this. It's like, what advice would you give to people doing an MBA to do a startup? It's like, well, don't do an MBA, like just do your startup. So like, obviously you can't say that in a class full of MBA students, but a lot of the stuff, like the biggest tip you can give to anyone in this space is just give it a go. Like, what's the worst that can happen? So it's a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about it, and not enough time just having a go and doing it. And don't get me wrong, obviously people have got different personal reasons why they can't take the risk at this time. But to be honest, if you want to do it, if you're of that personality, you'll always find an excuse. So I think you've got to just take yourself out of that comfort zone and give it a go. And remember that that big safe company that you worked for maybe isn't as big and safe as you thought. A lot of people, say, working at Anglo-Irish, thought they had a job for life, and they didn't. So I think we as a species, we're risk averse, and you kind of have to face into that a little bit if you want to be an entrepreneur. So.
Brilliant. Some great advice there. And I guess just to wrap up and close, I could talk to you all day, Chris, because I just find, your approach to talent management and entrepreneurship. And I learned a new word when we've talked previously, intrapreneur, which I think that probably refers to myself. What's next for you? So we've talked slightly about you're building a portfolio career or a fractional career. What's next for you? What have you got in process or in pipeline, or what you're hoping to do?
Well, I don't really know. That's kind of the joy of it, to be honest. So again, it's just, I think, opening yourself up to opportunities, to experiences, making some investments, doing some mentoring. Generally, I find, and again, this is different people have different ways of thinking, I guess, but I think by doing. So I need to put myself out there. I need to be exposed to ideas, to have ideas. It's that sort of mentality. Whereas, I know there are some people that can lock themselves in a shed in Scotland and come out with a great startup idea. That's not my way of doing it. So yeah, so I mean, my plan is, I do lots of events now, which I probably didn't have time, or I definitely didn't have time to do when I was actually working, doing the business full time. So, I think, being in markets, speaking to a lot of people in those markets, going to events, as I say, some informal mentoring, maybe some investments. So generally just testing the water in lots of different ways to sort of work out what works, if that makes sense. And obviously, don't get me wrong, I'm very lucky to be in a position where I can do that, because as I say, it is a lot about risk mentality, and not everyone can take that risk. But for me, I feel like that it's quite a good window for me to do that in now, and so that's my intention.
Fantastic. Quite an inspiration to everybody thinking of just doing it, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
And I think, your motto of think by doing is really some great advice there. Chris, thank you so much for today. If anybody wants to reach out to you, where's the best place for them to reach out to you?
Yeah, LinkedIn probably, isn't it? As I know we're on LinkedIn now, but generally it is the best place to get hold of anyone, isn't it? So,
and are you happy for anybody to reach out if they've got any further
questions?
Yeah,
just yeah, exactly. Just put a connection request, or ask the question. Happy to respond. Or I assume you'll put a post out, won't you? So if someone wants to ask a question in the comments, I'll try and answer it as well.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Well, the beauty with these LinkedIn Lives is the fact that they stay on the platform. We also post them on YouTube, and the conversation will continue because a lot of people do watch them on replay. So thank you so much, Chris, for joining us today. Thank you for anybody listening. Like Chris says, if you want to reach out to him, then please put a comment in the LinkedIn conversation and we can pick it up from there. And Chris, I wish you all the very best in your new ventures, in your portfolio career, for however long you decide to do that for. But thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Great. Cheers, Julie. Great to speak to you again.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.